So this month, I will be doing something a little bit different. For the month of August, I am doing what I'm calling the Sharpening Your Axe Summer Series, nonprofit strategy sessions on sustainability. August is a great time to slow down, to go deep, to learn, to plan, and to prepare for the hustle of the end of the year. Just like Abraham Lincoln said, if you give me 8 hours to chop down a tree, I'll spend 6 hours sharpening my axe. So, my goal with this series is to help you sharpen your proverbial organizational axe during the slower, somewhat days of summer. Each week, I'll be focusing on one of the core elements that make nonprofits strong: fundraising, boards, staff, finance, and organizational direction. Each week, I'll be sharing content that explores the theme from different angles, a combination of short form strategy tips, long form trainings that go deeper into some aspect of the theme, and always an encore podcast episode featuring me in more of a generative conversation with one of my incredible guests, exploring the theme from yet a third angle. These strategy sessions are fire. So grab a notebook, grab a pen, curl up someplace really comfy, and enjoy. Hi, this is the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, and I'm your host, Brooke Richie-Babbage. Each week, I do a deep dive into the mindset and strategies and tactics and tools of scaling an incredible high-impact nonprofit. I'm so glad you're here. So I've been doing these trainings in June, and each one has been sort of a response to specific questions that I get from the leaders that I work with in my accelerator program, the folks who are starting nonprofits that I work with in my Launch Lab course, and the coaching and consultation that I do. They sort of are grouped into these buckets of overwhelm, the kinds of things that just feel like a lot to organizational leaders. And so each training has focused on a particular area of your organization that I suggest that if you sharpen your focus on that area, your growth strategy, the design of your structures and your systems internally inside your organization, your budget, and today your board, if you focus on specific things within those areas, then you will be able to grow your organization with more clarity and less overwhelm. And my goal ultimately is to give you tools to help you reach more people, reach more communities, increase your impact and your budget, and to do it in a way that is smooth and sustainable, right? So that you don't feel like you're constantly throwing spaghetti against a wall. So in this fourth and final training, I'm going to talk about what to focus on with your board to support and fuel your growth. And I'm really happy to be talking about this topic because I think it's one that causes a lot of people a lot of stress. So I'm hoping to give you something sort of to sharpen your focus today. For those of you who are just joining me for the first time, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I came to be here. My name is Brooke Richie-Babbage. I am a social justice lawyer turned nonprofit founder multiple times over. I love launching and growing social justice movements and organizations. I have been launching, leading, or serving on the boards of nonprofits and social justice movements for the past 23 years now, which that number doesn't even sound right when I say it, but it's been a lot of years. I co-founded my first organization during my time at Harvard Law and the Kennedy School that combined legislative advocacy and education support in Boston schools for schools children who were being denied their educational rights. And I moved to New York to practice law, public interest law, at a nonprofit here called the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. I did impact litigation on behalf of low-income teen parents who were being denied the right to stay in high school because they were having kids, which sounds crazy now as I say it, but that is what was happening, 20 some odd years ago. And I loved that work. And so I did legislative advocacy and law, legal advocacy. And in working with the young parents, found that I was really drawn to the implementation piece of the law. that I was doing all of this work with amazing people all over the country to make sure that we had the right laws and crafted the right laws and they said the right thing. But that a lot of the young people that I was working with on the ground didn't know that. Right? They didn't know what the law said. They didn't know how to show up at a child care center or show up at their high school or their college and advocate for themselves. So I formed my second nonprofit here in New York, growing out of the work that I did as a lawyer. I ran that for about 12 years. And during that time, I joined boards. I have had the privilege and joy of being on more than a dozen boards as a member, as an officer, as a chair, and a secretary. I am a professor of social entrepreneurship and nonprofit leadership at the Brooke Graduate School of Public Affairs, which is here in New York City. And since 2017, I have been a full-time organizational design strategist and coach for nonprofit leaders. I'm the host of the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast, and I founded the Impact Accelerator, which I mentioned and we'll talk a little bit about later, and the Launch Lab programs about 2 years ago. So that's a little bit about me and sort of my joy and passion for what we're talking about here. What I will say is that one thing that I have come to know throughout all of that is that systems and focus, intentionality on systematizing and standardizing things is the key to growing your organization smoothly and without overwhelm. So I have dedicated this phase of my career to helping others, nonprofit leaders, turn their messy visions, the sort of chaos of running an organization into blueprints for action. And that sort of translation of chaos into order is it's my superpower. So that is what I do. And that is what I'm hoping to do today for you guys, to bring some order to your process of deepening the engagement and activation of your board. So I've got a sort of high impact training today. We're going to talk about why having an engaged board matters. Like, why is this one of the four sort of pillars that I suggest you focus on? I'm going to walk you through what an engaged and active board actually looks like. We're going to debunk a few myths about what it means to be sort of who should be on your board if you want an engaged and active board. I'll break down the how, the foundation and building blocks of an engaged board, and then I'm going to give some concrete ideas for how to actually implement what we're talking about, including how we can work together to explode the impact and productivity of your board and your staff and your fundraising. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start by talking for a moment about why this all matters. When we think about a board's engagement, our minds often immediately go to fundraising. I want a fundraising board. I want my board to fundraise. Why aren't my board members helping me fundraise? Absolutely one of the perennial frustrations and points of conflict and confusion for boards. But I want to suggest that fundraising isn't the magic. An engaged board, which is broader than fundraising and broader than governance, has a special magic all of its own. By stepping up as board members, you have people who have said, I care so much about this mission that I am going to bring my talents, my skills, my thinking, my energy, my connections to bear to make this mission a reality. When you have a whole group of people who have all shown up for that reason, there is a magic, I think Adam Grant calls it collective effervescence, right? That is greater than the sum of the parts of any individual board member. Externally, what this means, this special magic, is that your board members, truly connected and engaged board members, are your organization's fiercest cheerleaders and most vocal ambassadors. Internally, they're your most powerful strategists and thought partners. Right? Being a nonprofit leader can feel really lonely sometimes. And having board members as strategists and thought partners that you can actually pick up the phone and say, hey, I need a partner on this, or help me think through this, or can you introduce me to people that could help me think through this, or where should we go with this project? How should I think about this? So that people out on the limb with you can feel really like you're being held, right? And so that's sort of the power internally. When it comes to it, an organization's mission is a true North Star. And for those of you who've heard others of my trainings, I talk about the importance of your North Star. being clear about what you're trying to do in the world. And next to the executive director, the board should be the group of people who see that North Star most clearly and who are running as fast as possible towards it. Because you can't achieve your mission alone. An engaged and active board is your crew. That's how you should feel. That's the special magic of an engaged board. And that's why this matters so much, particularly if you're thinking about growing your impact, or you want to grow your budget, you have to have a crew. So when you're trying to get to this magical board, build a high impact, engaged board, it's really important to know what you're looking for, right? What indicators to look for? What is an engaged board? What does it look like? How does it actually move through the world? So the first thing I want to say about this is that this is not a training about board governance. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into the mechanics of good governance. It is absolutely important that your board be engaged in good, effective governance. But I'm talking about today the special magic of board engagement and activation is more than good governance. I want to paint a picture of the indicators of engagement that let you know that your board members feel connected, because that's where their action is going to come from. This is aligned with and supports good governance, but it's deeper and more expansive, and that's more important than just checking the boxes of having the right committees or having the right officers. Right? So let's start with what it isn't. These attributes are not necessarily predictors of engagement. There are certain attributes that when we are looking to grow our board, expand our board, trying to figure out who the right people to be on the board are, they are often held up as predictors of potential sort of fundraising ability, right? Or impact, right? If we have these attributes, we will have a board that will fundraise on our behalf, that will be out in the world as ambassadors on our behalf. Contrary to common belief, engaged board members are not just, and I'm going to go through each one of the sort of common ones, people with mission alignment, right? Mission alignment is 100% critical. It is a must-have for board members, for the board members that are going to be engaged. If you remember that special magic that I described a few minutes ago, I said these are people who believe so much in your mission, right? So mission alignment is absolutely necessary, but it is not sufficient. People who are really excited about your mission don't necessarily make the best board members if they don't have some other things. They can be great advisors. They can be great volunteers. They can be amazing ambassadors as donors. They can care about the mission, but not necessarily have the time or inclination to invest in the other things that make good board members, in good governance, in showing up, in learning, and being engaged, right? So absolutely, you need board members that have deep mission alignment, but that by itself doesn't make them the best board members. You want to look for other indicators, and I'm going to talk about what those are. A second one is access to wealth and resources, and this is a big one. People who have access to wealth and resources will not necessarily leverage that wealth and those resources for the organization. They may, but whether or not they have access to wealth and resources is not actually the indicator of whether they will leverage those resources for this organization. So just having wealthy people on your board, just having deeply resourced or networked people on your board by itself is not actually sufficient it's not a sufficient indicator of future engagement. These people can be great donors. They can be great donor ambassadors, right? Askers on your behalf. They can be wonderful when you have a fundraising campaign or a fundraising event and you're looking for host committees. You can leverage them in really concrete ways in order to access that wealth and resource. But again, as a board member, there are other things you're going to be looking for. So these three things, the wealth and the resources and the networks and the mission alignment, are all deeply important. So I don't want to discount them. And they can fuel and support engagement. But when we focus too much on these things, they can become distractions from the real core of a healthy, high-impact board. So instead, I want to walk through 6 core indicators that you want to focus on for your board. The first is engaged board members that will actually help you grow and fundraise are people who work between board meetings. That means different things based on the person, but it means that they pick up the phone when you call. It means that they are willing to put in more hours than your typical supporter to respond to that email that you sent at 10 o'clock at night. It means when you have a training about your mission or graduation from your programs or a park dedication for a new community that you've gone into, they show up, right? They work between meetings. So when you're thinking about who you're looking for, one of the things you want to ask yourself is this somebody who has the time and the inclination to work between meetings? If not, could they be a great advisor? Could they be a great volunteer? Could they be a great ambassador? Is there some other way to structure our relationship to leverage their interest without them being on the board? Second, they come to meetings. And when they come to meetings, they show up prepared. They have read the board book. They have asked, they come with the questions they want to ask. They have looked at the budget and the actuals. They've done the work so that they can be active participants in the meetings, right? They are not showing up for a show or a presentation. And some of this is about how we structure board meetings, which I'm going to talk about. Right? You want your board meetings to be generative and engaging. You want people to have a reason to show up, but you also need them to have the inclination to attend and to be prepared when they show up, right? That's an indicator of engagement. They actively engage with the organization's mission. And that either means either or both through its programming, attending programming, finding a way to support programming, participating in programming, lending their skills, expertise networks to support programming, and or working with your staff. So your leadership team, lending their skills, lending their expertise, being thought partners and strategists with your leadership team. This also means that when they're asked by someone outside of the organization, they can go beyond just articulating the mission statement, right? They can really explain the reason the organization exists and why it matters. They get it. That's an indicator of engagement, right? That will lay the foundation for engagement. So you're looking for people as you bring people on your board, as you think about how you structure your board and how you're engaging the board, you want to build this up, right? Provide opportunities for them to learn. Make sure that the people that you're onboarding have the inclination, have the ability, and the interest in truly engaging with the mission and its work. They hold the values of the organization, right? And they embody the organization's special sauce. Every organization, every institution is an organism, right? It has an energy about it that is unique. And one of the primary activities and forms of engagement for a board member is to hold that special sauce, to embody that in the world on behalf of the organization, so that people who engage with them as board members understand, oh, I am getting a sense for how that organization moves through the world. This person is a representative of that organization. And finally, they actively seek to learn and grow and build their skills as board members. So they want to be better board members. They see this as a particular and discrete role, which it is. It is not just 4 meetings a year. It is a thing that they have signed up to do. It's a role that they have taken on, being a board member. If they are an officer, there are things to learn there. What does it mean to be a board treasurer? How can you grow your skills? How can you learn what it means to be a board chair for this organization, right? How, from a legal perspective, can you actually add value as a board secretary? And so they are willing to and actively seek to learn, to grow their skills. Finally, governance is messy. Right? It's one of those wonky, jargony terms that nobody really knows what it means other than read the budget, show up at meetings, right? There's a whole sort of checklist of things that we can talk about when we talk about governance. But true governance is messy, right? It involves asking some tough questions sometimes about mission alignment and growth. It involves having really important conversations as the nonprofit leader thinks about hiring and weighs, the growth of staff with the offering of benefits. And it means helping think through real world problems like what kind of corporations will we partner with and who are we willing to take money from? It's not always easy and it's not always clear. And so really engaged board members are people who are willing to wade into that messiness with you, right? It means they're not looking for neat and tidy to show up at a board meeting, have someone present, sort of the director's report, vote on a couple things, look at the budget and go home, right? They are thought partners around governing the organization. So these are the 6 core indicators that you want to focus on for your board, indicators of engagement. Think about how to recruit for these behaviors. Think about how to drive and support these behaviors, the people on your board, rather than focusing on the structure. Do we have the right committees? Or, one of those buckets in the myths slide that I talked about, right? Do we have people who are really, really wealthy? Do we have people who know a lot of people? What you actually want are people who you can answer yes to when you ask, do they have the time? Do they have the inclination to do these things? And then structurally, are we creating a board culture? Are we doing our board meetings and holding our board meetings in a way? Are we engaging between board meetings in a way that supports these indicators of engagement? This is what you want to focus on if you want to get to that magic that we talked about. So let's drill down even further to the how. How do you build these forms of engagement? How do you create a board that is inclined to work between meetings and show up prepared and engage with the mission and build their skills? How do you build this magical board? So there's one thing that is at the core of this kind of engagement. And it's a concept that when I learned it about 9 years ago, really crystallized for me so much of what I had seen in practice over the 2 decades of my own board service on really high functioning boards and some that weren't as high functioning. It's this concept of trust for action. It is the foundation of any high functioning team, which is what a board is. It's a team. Any team that has to do something together, that has to accomplish an end goal together. In this case, it is the stewardship of the mission. It is effective governance. It's the key to everything. And it is a critical ingredient to your growth. Without this form of trust, your board will falter. You will feel like you're dragging them along. You're going to feel resentment. They might feel disengaged and disconnected, and you'll be overwhelmed. So let me explain what I mean by trust for action. Trust for action is a form of connection that is focused on a group's ability to work together towards a common goal. The more of this type of trust that each member has for the leadership of the organization and for the other members, the more engaged they will be. Ultimately, engaged board members feel invested in taking and are able to take action. In this case, governance, together as a team. They want to do those things that I highlighted in the what slides, right? What does engagement look like? There's this great podcast by also Adam Grant. I realize I've referenced him twice now. He has this great podcast on his episode on his work life podcast about astronauts. And he talks about how these 4 astronauts weren't necessarily friends. They wouldn't have sort of hung out together outside of their work, but they trusted one another with their lives out in space. They cared fiercely about the same mission, and they believed that they had the same set of core values in relation to that mission, that they were there for the same reason, that they were trying to do the same thing, and they trusted one another to achieve that thing together. So at the core of trust for action, one of the reasons I like that episode is it highlights that at the core of trust for action isn't trust for liking, which is how we typically talk about trust. Would I have coffee with this person? I really want my board members to like one another. Absolutely, yes, 100%. The best boards I've ever been on have been people who like one another, but not necessarily people who are friends outside of being on the board. What we had was a deep connection to the mission, a sense of one another's shared connection to the mission, and a belief that we shared the same underlying values about how to be on this board. And that connection, and I'm going to walk through what that looks like in practice, is what fueled our ability to take action together, to be a high impact board. So let's talk through the mechanics of trust for action. And again, here we're sort of notching down. We want that magic, that special magic that you get on a board. We talked about what indicators of engagement to look for that will bubble up to and add up to that magic. And now this is the lever to pull. This is the thing to focus on that will lead to those indicators of engagement, right? Those forms of engagement. There are 4 questions to ask yourself. Trust for action is rooted in these 4 questions to ask yourself as a board. These 4 questions essentially are dimensions of trust that serve as anchors for board engagement. When engagement and activity begin to fade or lose focus, which often they do, right? You find that over the course of a year, board attendance at meetings go down, or over the course of a board member's term, their engagement goes down. Right? The answers to these 4 questions that I'm going to walk through can help the group, as a group, stay connected and get sort of regrounded in the kind of energy that will fuel their engagement, right? Reconnecting to these questions. It's also really good to notch down how we think about engagement to more basic building blocks. It can be really overwhelming to think, how do I get this board engaged? How do I get this board to fundraise? Like, there are too many people and there are too many interests and there are too many interactions for that to be something you can figure out without feeling overwhelmed, which is why so many people feel overwhelmed. So instead, thinking at the level of mechanics and returning to these questions can help you focus, systematically identify which levers to pull with each board member, as well as for the board collectively. Remember, the whole theme of these trainings is where can you focus so that you can sort of let go of some of the noise and just focus on the right levers to pull to continue to move forward and grow smoothly. This is one of those sort of mechanical levers, right? These 4 questions to get at the core of how you make your board feel engaged. And then finally, one of the hallmarks of a high impact board is self-governance. You get to the point where your board is like a flywheel. It's doing a lot of the sort of supporting engagement and building collective knowledge and engaging in the work, all of those indicators of engagement. It's perpetuating those as an entity unto itself. These questions give your board chair and your board governance committee a roadmap for promoting engagement among their peers on the board. So here's the first question. Are we all committed to the same end goal? Are we here for a reason that we care deeply about? Right? Asking this question once a year, once a term, every other year at a retreat. How would you identify the mission and why are you here? Right? Are we here for the same reason? This is where clarity about the mission and making sure that your board members actually know what the mission is and how it plays out in the world can be really important. And I guarantee you that there are board members who vaguely get it, right? They know the issue that you work on. They know the mission statement. And that's about as deep as they could go. And that's enough for them initially. But true engagement is really rooted in, oh, I really get this mission in this work. When I'm out in the world, I can talk about this the same way someone on the staff can talk about it. And I see how this is relevant in my life, right? The other way that this plays out is your board really clear about your strategic goals, right? What you are specifically trying to build and do as an organization in the next 3 to 5 years? And that North Star is fuzzy. When the sort of goals, what the work is that you're trying to accomplish, the outcomes you're trying to accomplish, when that's fuzzy, the priorities are fuzzy, then sometimes engagement can start to wane because people don't necessarily know what they're working towards. And as leaders, we can know in our minds, oh yeah, like I've got the goal, I've got the plan, I know how this program and this partnership play into everything. A senior board does not have that level of clarity, right? So this question is really about, are we clear about what we're doing, what our mission is, what our priorities, our goals are, and are we all committed to that? And you may occasionally, I've absolutely been on boards where this has been the case, and I have felt this as a board member, that as things start to change, as priorities change, as my life changes, you may have board members say, actually, I love this mission and this work. I'm not actually as committed I can't be as committed. My life has changed. My circumstances have changed. The goals and priorities are different now than they were 3 years ago when I joined the board. So you really need to make sure that there's space for your board to answer this question honestly with one another. The second question is, how much can I count on the other people in this board to stay committed to the end goal? Right? This is about, do I believe that I can count on you, other board member, to follow through on your commitments? Do we have a shared commitment? So this is where clarity about expectations is really critical. You're going to lose engagement if, A, people don't know what they're being asked to do. What is the give-get? How many meetings? What does work between meetings look like? How do you want them to engage in programs? What are their options? What can they sign up for? If it's too fuzzy and it doesn't fit into the sort of ongoing movie of their lives in a way that they can hold on to, they're just going to disengage, and not in an active sort of mean way, like, I don't want to do this. Just, it's not clear. So their brain doesn't settle on it. Right? They don't settle on the actions and behaviors that you want them to take. B, you're going to lose engagement when what they're being expected to do keeps shifting, right? So clarity and consistency is really important. And finally, if they look around and they see that other people on the board aren't following through, that breaks trust for action, right? Remember, the core of trust for action is we're committed to the same end goal and we're sharing the same level of commitment and values around our commitment. If I look around and other people aren't coming to meetings, nobody's ever at the programs, nobody's engaging in work, nobody's giving, or there's sort of a critical mass of people who aren't, it reduces my sense of sort of accountability to this group, right? I don't actually think that we have a shared commitment. And so that's often something that we will see that is happening sort of behind the scenes or sort of at a more root level in people's minds that they're not always conscious of. Conversely, this dimension of trust for action about shared commitment can be demonstrated by things like showing up at meetings, providing opportunities in each meeting, or even doing this in sort of update emails of concrete ways that each member has contributed. I want to say thank you to Marjorie for hopping on the phone with me, to walk through that letter of interest to this new funder. And Edward, that was really, really helpful that, you taking a look at that email. And it was so great that you came to our graduation, Sharon. So just little mentions so that people are getting the signal, oh, there is work happening here, right? We all are on board. It also just makes it harder for people not to be engaged when everybody else is being engaged. Third, do we have a set of shared values that I can turn to? For example, if I believe that we have a shared value around making sure that the organization is financially healthy, if I really believe that you share that value, then I'm going to trust that the actions you take in service of that are aligned with that value, whether I agree with the actions or not. This makes wading into the messy and sometimes uncomfortable zone of tough conversations, decision-making, financials, et cetera, easier. It can reduce barriers to or sort of friction around engagement. As an example, there's an organization that I've worked really closely with, amazing organization here in the city, that decided to get rid of their give-get. And this is, at the time, was a $2.5 million organization, had a really active board, about 12 to 15 people. And so they were sort of addressing this sort of radical idea of just totally getting rid of the give-get, which felt radical to them because A, they'd always had one, and B, best practice was telling them boards at this level have a give-get. It is clear, it's confirmed, everybody knows, right? What they found is that they spent some real time at a retreat talking about what financial health meant to the organization and making sure that they had a shared understanding and commitment to that value. And then what they found is that people's engagement around the financials, reading them, understanding them, asking questions about them, right, measuring and tracking financial health, and around fundraising increased because they're like, oh, we all have something to bring to bear to make sure that this organization stays financially healthy. We all agree on what that means. We all understand. I see how I fit, right? It meant that they could give at different amounts because nobody was saying, oh, the reason you are giving less is because you value the health of this organization less. They knew they were on the same page. So it made engaging with the financials less tactical and less transactional for them as a board. It was a really fascinating case study. The fourth question is, am I able to bring value to this endeavor? This dimension of added value. Belief in one's own value on a team is absolutely critical for engagement and for trust for action, for sort of building the kind of trust that allows boards to move to action together. This is where working individually with board members to make sure that they have meaningful ways to be involved and meaningful to them, right? Ways that don't feel just performative. Because even if you can check a box that says, this person came to our graduation, if that board member feels that engagement is just performative, meaning they checked a box and it isn't actually meaningful, they know that. That doesn't feel like meaningful engagement. They don't necessarily see how their skills or their interests are actually being helpful in moving this organization forward. They may question how their skills and interests are in alignment with the needs or the strategic priorities of the organization. Conversely, when we find opportunities to recognize and celebrate different forms of contribution, individually and as a group, they can see and find ways in, personalized engagement plans, for example, they can find ways in and say to themselves, actually, when I do work between meetings, when I show up, when I ask questions, I am adding value. So let's make this real and talk about some best practices. How can you actually implement this? So there's 3 buckets that I'm going to talk about: beginnings of relationship, meetings, and ongoing connection. So beginnings, the beginning of your relationship with your board. First thing to think about, a robust orientation, right? Explicit introduction to the board, to organizational culture, creating an intentional connection to a staff liaison, someone on your leadership team that they can call and ask questions, especially in those early months, making sure that, going back to this clarity, making sure that they understand how the mission plays itself out in the world. They see a copy of the strategic plan so they understand the priorities and the goals that the organization is working towards. They know what the goals of the board are, right? So that orientation shouldn't just be they come to the first meeting or meet with the executive director. It should be robust and should absolutely walk them through what they need to know. And you can actually look at each of the 6 indicators of engagement and think, what do I need to give this new board member so that they are set up to engage in this way? Right? Use it as a checklist. Clear expectations about engagement, thinking things like personalized board engagement plans, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Beginnings with board buddies are also really important. So assign new board members a board buddy to serve as a mentor for the first few meetings, not just that first meeting. This could basically look like sitting next to them at the meeting, making sure, calling them before the first meeting to say, hey, let's talk through the board book together so that this is usually where we spend a lot of time. This is how our conversations about the budget usually look, so that they actually can dive right in and be engaged from the beginning. And then finally, connecting them to the right work. A lot of boards have committees. They can be a really powerful and important way to organize your work. Making sure that the board member is assigned or connects immediately to a committee, since that's usually where the work between meetings happens, and that it's the right committee for them so that they can ensure early engagement. They can see that added value right from the beginning. The second dimension of implementing what we've talked about is actually how you hold your meetings themselves. Here, the key is to structure board time together, board agendas, conversations, in ways that deepen the sense of connection to things that really matter. You want to use your time together to stoke interest, to inspire, and to really tap the board members as generative and strategic partners. Anything that you can do asynchronously, meaning by email, sending them reports, do that asynchronously and use your time in ways that builds a sense of connection and stokes the fire of interest and excitement. Few ways to do that. Mission moments. Board members feel engaged when they are confident that they know about the mission, what it takes to advance it, and how it's showing up in their lives. You can take a moment, beginning, middle, end of each meeting to say, hey, would anybody like to share something they've done or seen since the last board meeting that is relevant to the mission, right? This is an opportunity for board members to say, this is how I've supported the mission. I came to this program and loved it. This is how I've seen the mission out in the world, right? I would often seed these mission moments before going into board meetings so that I knew that there would be one or two at each meeting. I'd get in touch and say, hey, Charlie, it was really awesome that your email to me about the video montage that I sent you just seemed awesome. It seemed like that really resonated. Would you share that with the board when we get there? Right. So making sure that people are hearing from one another. Hey, I'm engaged. This is how the mission shows up for me. A second tool is something called a consent agenda. So a consent agenda is a board meeting practice that groups routine business and reports into one agenda item that can then be approved in one action rather than lots of votes, lots of motions on each item separately. Using a consent agenda for things like, voting on partnerships or voting on the minutes, agreeing to pass certain motions with respect to the strategic plan, right? Things that don't really require approving, acknowledging the director's report. Using a consent agenda can save boards a half an hour, right? 45 minutes of discussion, particularly if the way that they're used encourages board members to read reports asynchronously. So the director's report is sent as part of the board book. Maybe the fundraising report is sent as part of the board book. All of the report outs, the committee reports that tend to happen at board meetings, send them asynchronously as part of the board book. And then the consent agenda is any questions about any of the things in the board book. Do we approve the meeting minutes? Do we approve the shift in the calendar? One vote and you move on. Third, provide small-scale training opportunities. Remember I said sort of build active engagement around building their skills. You can build skill building into your meetings. Small activities that make board members feel competent and help them see one another as competent can be really powerful. Practicing asking, going through drafting talking points, marketing training, governance training, right? How do you read financials? Sometimes those sort of concrete tactical skill building opportunities are really, really great for level setting on a board. Inside baseball, basically what I mean here is most board members, as your board grows and you get to a real governance board size, they're not going to be experts on your mission or your issue. And that's fine, right? They bring other expertise and skills and perspectives to the table. So you want to make your in-person meetings an opportunity to educate and inspire them so that when they're out in the world and you're asking them to be an ambassador, they feel like they actually know what they're talking about, right? So I've seen organizations do things like once a year they bring in, if there's a government official or a government agency that you partner with, bring in somebody from that agency to give them a policy background update, do a legal training if there are legal implications or policy implications for your work. If you do work in parks, there's this amazing organization that did work in playgrounds and parks. And so they brought somebody in from the parks department to sort of talk about, hey, this is what this sort of behind the scenes process of partnering with us looks like. And this is how it has transformed utilization of our playground or our park. People feel like, oh, I'm on a board. I'm not just getting the donor report. I actually understand how the secret sauce is made. And that feels really good. And that stokes engagement. And finally, I want to spend a little bit of time on this last one. I call it the generative arc. So the generative arc framework is a way to structure your work and your conversations so that your board is continually being asked to think about the future of the organization and to think big picture about the organization. And it's sort of the opposite of the kinds of tactical things you can do asynchronously. Your in-person meetings are really an opportunity to engage the group in conversations they have to be together to have. So I want to spend just a moment on this one because it's really powerful as a way to transform your board meetings. So there's three ways to engage your group: generative thinking, strategic thinking, and tactical thinking. And generative thinking is broad. It's about who we are, it's mission, it's are we still relevant, how are we moving through the world, what is our secret sauce, right? Strategic thinking is, okay, now that, and it grows out of the generative thinking. We understand our mission. We understand sort of big picture questions about our purpose and our why and our impact in the world. What is the plan for achieving that why? Right? Strategic thinking is, what is the plan? This is weighing pros and cons. This is looking at return on investments. This is making decisions about what counts and what doesn't, what to say yes to and what to say no to. So meetings are best, in-person meetings are best when they are some combination, and this can be within a meeting or between meetings, between the generative and the strategic, right? They are opportunities to actually bring thought to bear, thought, strategy, perspectives to bear around issues that are real, right? You don't want to make up fake generative questions, but we are launching this new program in a new community, and I'm concerned or just am wondering about how we make sure, because we're new to this community, that we're not sort of flying in and like plopping down with some new program. Like, how do we make sure that what we're doing is relevant? Like, what's our marketing? How do we connect to the community? Right? That's a very real generative in terms of how we move through the world, and strategic in terms of who we should be partnering with and what we should do. That's a real question that a real organization that I work with focused on, actually multiple of them. That's a great conversation for your board, because it actually pulls back the curtain and shows them how you are doing your work. And their perspectives can absolutely be relevant and helpful, right? So and that's not an email, right? That's something that is better in person. So that kind of generative and strategic thinking. It also helps board members learn about one another, right? How they think, how they work. The third bucket is ongoing engagement. So this is a tricky one because most board members report that communication is a problem. They're just not going to read a lot of emails, right? It's really hard to keep board members participating outside of meetings, right? They don't come to committee meetings. Like, that work between meetings piece is hard to construct. So I just want to offer 3 tools that have been effective at maintaining an ongoing engagement in a way that supports the kind of board engagement we've been talking about. The first is a personalized engagement plan. And I recommend doing these every year and checking in mid-year. These are one-on-one deep conversations, 30, 45 minutes with each board member, that identifies unique personal avenues for engagement and fundraising. Right? Here is what we're doing. Here's our strategic plan for 3 years, for the next year. Here's what we've talked about on the board. Let's map out and document how you're going to plug in, where you're going to show up, what networks make the most sense for you to plug in, what you're excited about and why, right? You document it, and then you check in with them midway through the year. That level of concreteness that brings to the surface what they have committed to do is really powerful. A second that is related are these biannual one-on-one conversations. So at least twice a year, sit down with each board member. I used to do this quarterly, actually. Sit down with each board member and say, how are you doing? What is exciting about what we're doing? I've noticed you've been really engaged. I love it. Fantastic. How can we keep this up? I've noticed you haven't been really engaged. What's up, right? What do you need? What's missing? How can we plug you back in? Let me tell you about what's on our calendar. Do we want to adjust your engagement plan? Is there something coming up that's really exciting, right? These conversations make them feel like they are on your team. And finally, a dashboard. These sort of quarterly or bi-monthly, every other month. You could do it monthly. I used to do it monthly. Update dashboard that highlights high-level key financial and non-financial engagements and contributions and ways in. And I have on my website some examples of how to think about these dashboards in the resource section. They're really powerful. Most board members aren't going to read emails. Many aren't going to read long emails, but they will look at a dashboard that says, that shows money in, money out, press coverage, program graduations, new hires. Here's a great article about our issue, right? And you have them identify what are the 4 or 5 things that they care most about that will actually help them feel informed about your work. And then you report on that in this dashboard. So let's recap. We talked about why board engagement is so important, how it's the fuel for the impact you want your organization to have. We talked about the core element of engagement and the mechanics of trust for action, And I shared just a few strategies and tactics and best practices to begin to implement what we talked about today. Ultimately, what I wanted to give you is information and tools to help you take your board and your organization's capacity, sort of people power, to the next level. I know that if you're watching this training, it's because you want board members that are excited about your mission, that can help you map out your vision and think through problems and solutions, that can bring in new people and new resources into the organization. I also want to recap the 4 trainings we've done as a whole, what you've learned and how they work together to help your organization grow smoothly and without overwhelm. We've talked in the first training about how you need to think strategically about the growth stage that you're at and what the next best step is for you to take if you want to scale in a sustainable way. We talked about what the stages of growth are and specific questions that you can focus on to guide you through your movement through those stages. We talked about the building blocks of a high-impact organization and about how to think concretely about the design choices you make inside your organization so that you're focusing on the right thing to move you to whatever your next growth stage is. In the last training, we talked about the power of a growth budget and about how that's actually the blueprint for translating all of this thinking that you did in the strategy part into revenue. That's the bridge between strategy and more money is your growth budget. And I talked about how that works in the last training. And then today we talked about how to activate your board, right? What's at the core of true engagement. And when you have true engagement, that special magic that we talked about, you will have a board that will be your thought partner in your fundraising, in your strategy, in doing all of the things that we've talked about in this series.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of the Nonprofit Mastermind podcast. I always have so much fun doing these episodes. Definitely check out the links to all of the goodies that I mentioned in this episode. You can get that at brookerichiebabbage.com/podcast for the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode and think that you have a friend or colleague who would also enjoy, I would love if you would leave a review and share. Have a great week.